Central to Winston's journey in this dystopian classic is his dangerous and intense affair with Julia. Yet while often characterised as a love affair, on a deeper reflection of events, were Winston and Julia really in love? Welcome to 1984 Law, and today we consider the pros and cons of this issue. The answer may actually be more complex than some suspect. Firstly, let's consider the very catalyst of the affair itself. The literal love note passed to Winston is unambiguous. The words, "I love you," stunning Winston from initial dislike of Julia to secret longing to meet her. However, just because these words are clear does not mean Julia necessarily meant for them to be taken literally. As discussed in a previous video, such traceable messages are highly risky and dangerous in the heavily monitored society of Oceania. With every person a possible spy or grass, at every building, and even an individual's very home, teeming with telescreens and microphones, such a physical message could easily be spotted, and through the handwriting traced to a culprit. Any message needs to be short, unambiguous, and to the point. Those three words achieved this. Rather than words like, "meet me at so-and-so," she used those words to make her intention as clear as possible. A message like, "meet me at so-and-so," could be interpreted as a trap or threat. The word love, rather than like, is also more definitive. It also seems appropriate to the context. Any unsanctioned contact between a male and a female party member, especially an intimate relationship, was highly forbidden. So going to the extreme, that is, "I love you," rather than the more lukewarm "I like you," is perfectly natural. The overarching point then is that the word was used almost certainly functionally, which worked too. Julia's note perfectly conveyed her intentions, Winston scarcely doubting her after receiving it. That the two had never properly met before also adds weight to our deliberations here. At least at this stage, it's rather silly to believe that either felt any genuine affection towards the other, let alone love. Indeed, we know how Winston felt towards Julia, at least prior to their meetings, as he clearly expresses his emotions. Winston is simultaneously both attracted to her and disgusted by her too. Winston's attraction is complex and does evolve throughout his time with her. Prior to the note, his attraction is physical, but also political. At the 2 minutes hate, he fantasizes about forcing himself on her. This dark thought mixed with the more violent one of killing her at the moment of climax. This may seem random at first, but actually serves to express both his raw physical desire for her, but also his hatred of the party, as well as the political world and orthodoxy, which he also equates with her sort. Winston certainly believes that Julia is likely a typically bigoted fanatic of the party, and so to be avoided. In addition to his thoughts about Julia at the 2 minutes hate, Winston also has an erotic dream of Julia stripping naked, though this act also links to his other politically tinged attraction to her too. Indeed, this vision seems to foreshadow this dimension of his attraction. The actual quote is as follows, quote, "The girl with dark hair was coming towards him across the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm." What's interesting with this particular quote is the political side to his attraction to her, though it may be more accurate still to pinpoint the implied act of an affair, or its implication here that particularly attracts him in that moment. Winston even admits Julia's naked body did not arouse him at that point, but the gesture itself particularly fascinated him. Given the aforementioned taboo on affairs between party members and Winston's hatred of Big Brother and the party, it's no wonder he attaches such significance to the gesture itself in which Julia removes her attire in his dream. This sentiment ties to the later scene already analysed in 1984 Law's previous video, Sex as Rebellion. Here Winston is pleased that Julia has had scores of intimate encounters, perhaps many partners. This goes beyond the act itself. It's the undermining of the party itself that fills Winston with hope and excitement. That many party men had committed adultery was evidence the system was not perfect. My point is, at this stage in their relationship, it's difficult to argue Winston loved Julia in any literal sense. If he did develop feelings for her, then it was later in their affair, as we shall soon see. Before we do, it's worth considering, more properly speculating really, how Julia felt at the time prior to their meeting too. Again, just thinking about this with some common sense, it's hard to believe Julia loved Winston, though there was obviously at least an attraction there. Julia, after all, initiated contact with the note to begin with, though if we read between the lines, it's likely they have had contact and other subtle signs of being mutually attracted to one another before then. Julia's initiation of contact was certainly not baseless. In the Golden Country scene, she explains that she saw something in Winston's face that suggested he was against them and thought she would take a chance. Presumably, she saw potential there for what eventually occurred, a love affair. One thing occasionally asked is why Julia felt attracted to Winston to begin with. I personally think it's quite obvious that, though he's not Airstrip 1's answer to Brad Pitt, Winston's attraction to Julia is for his subtle attitude and personality. She sees something in him that suggests rebellion. From this seed of thought, it's not difficult to imagine her constructing a pleasant image of the man of her dreams, or at least of a man, a dangerous and exciting man she would like to know much better. It didn't escape my notice during the meeting scene that she already knows his name at least, even saying she's probably better at finding things out than he is. She's clearly interested enough in him to be digging about for these details anyway, though finding out his name may seem trivial. Even such basic information about people you don't know is likely difficult to obtain given the nature of the society she lives in. Julia's raw attraction, then, seems just as intent as Winston's at this point. A key passage in support of this early lust over true love interpretation is Winston's own view on the first meeting, in which he described it more as an act of the will. The love-making, as he frequently describes it, was more of a given at that moment, given the mutual physical attraction. At the same time, however, Winston himself notes how his attitude had shifted, and it's this long but key quote that truly shows the change to love, at least in Winston. Quote, "During the month that he had known her, the nature of his desire for her had changed. At the beginning there had been little true sensuality in it. Their first love-making had been simply an act of the will, but after the second time, it was different. The smell of her hair, the taste of her mouth, the feeling of her skin seemed to have got inside him, or into the air all around him. She had become a physical necessity. When she said that she could not come, he had the feeling that she was cheating him. But just at this moment, the crowd pressed them together, and their hands accidentally met. She gave the tips of his fingers a quick squeeze that seemed to invite not desire, but affection. It struck him that when one lived with a woman, this particular disappointment must be a normal, recurring event, and a deep tenderness, such as he had not felt for her before, suddenly took hold of him. Winston furthermore fantasizes about the pair being married and living in a world similar to ours, in which such a relationship was just normal. He daydreams of buying things for the household and discussing trivialities. Clearly at this stage, I think we can say with some certainty that the relationship has matured, even if it's still young. Julia's reassuring finger squeeze expresses something more than just a carnal arrangement somehow, and Winston's own words are evidence enough of his own feelings beyond just the lovemaking they have. A scene later on that really seals the deal for me, at least on Winston's end, is in Part 2, Chapter 7. Quote, "The one thing that matters is that we shouldn't betray one another, although even that can't make the slightest difference. If you mean confessing," she said, "we shall do that right enough. Everybody always confesses. You can't help it. They torture you. I don't mean confessing. Confession is not betrayal. What you say or do doesn't matter. only feelings matter. If they could make me stop loving you, that would be the real betrayal. Unlike the use of the word at the very beginning of their relationship, it's difficult to argue that love here is not used in the literal sense. Here we are 3 chapters on from the crowd scene with the affectionate squeeze of Winston's fingers. What's more, we know this feeling is genuine, as it forms the last inner resistance Winston holds onto until his final submission in room 101, and is therefore an important core of his character at this point. Earlier in the novel, we see Winston muse on the importance of feelings, especially love itself, pondering the unconditional maternal love of his mother for him, which was also mirrored in the Jewish woman and her son, who were blown up in the war film he watched. For Winston, such feelings are yet another horror inflicted by the inhuman world he lives in, another indignity demanded by the party, that such natural feelings had to be relearned by people like him. Indeed, Winston regretfully laments on how, as a child, he had been too selfish and hungry to love his mother back, that in the movie theatre he had belittled the prole woman's reaction to the explosion, and that he had also coldly kicked aside the severed hand during the rocket bomb attack. Proles, he thought, were still human beings, whereas party members were not. Feelings are all important to him, as they are all that separate him from the party NPCs. Even his love for Julia, then, is thus a political act of a sort. Winston later convinced, as we saw in the last passage, that at least that could not be taken from him. That one betrayal was one beyond the party's power to provoke. Unfortunately, as we all know, this turns out not to be true. By this point then, it's certain that Winston does indeed love Julia, or up until his fateful time in room 101 anyway. So, what about Julia? We saw the affectionate squeeze of the fingers in the scene before last, but note that she did not actually verbally reciprocate Winston's declaration of love in chapter 7. Well, as you may have guessed, I believe Julia's confirmation of her own feelings comes a little later in the meeting with O'Brien. A quick point is to emphasise the fact that Julia even follows Winston to meet O'Brien is in itself a strong indication of their bond at this point, since Julia herself was not invited to O'Brien's flat. I'm confident that Julia before Winston would not have dreamed of risking such a move, even perhaps for a former lover, yet there she was following Winston to the home of an inner party member, on little more than a flash of the eyes and Winston's secret hopes. At that meeting, of course, we see Winston speaking for both of them, and Julia mostly remains silent. There may be other reasons for this on the part of Orwell, but I believe one reason she does remain so quiet throughout the meeting was to emphasise what happened when O'Brien suggested that they may have to permanently split. Her no seems rather clear to me. Interestingly, Winston is somewhat speechless. For a few seconds, his lips and tongue fumbling on different words before settling on the mirroring of Julia's no. What exactly Winston may have considered answering with before his own no is up for debate, but he did finally reject this too. My theory on this curious reaction from Winston is that it was not so much hesitance as shock, that is, pleasant surprise. I could be wrong, but Winston may simply have been genuinely taken aback by Julia's indirect expression of love, and so it took him a few seconds to recover. Another obvious interpretation of his hesitance is that he was simply going to assent to this too, without much thought. A very minor spoiler for the novel Julia. Please click ahead to avoid this. In Newman's novel, Julia interprets this as though Winston was about to say yes to that too, and that Winston was a little annoyed, but begrudgingly said no too. As with many things with Newman's novel, however, I don't quite buy this interpretation of events. Orwell is not that specific on exactly what other words Winston was trying to say. For all we know, it could have been a variation of the negative, such as never or something similar. What we can take away from this scene, at least in relation to our interest today, is that Julia was not willing to part with Winston, and on that point alone she objected, which is no small thing when O'Brien reels off all the other things they may be expected to do, such as forgery, sabotage, betraying their country, and murder, to name some. A final observation that the two really were in love is the final conversation we see them have after their time in the Ministry of Love. We delve more into this scene in the video Did Julia Face Room 101? So it suffices for us to note here that Julia indeed, like Winston, had to face her worst fear, and that in doing so, it strongly hinted that it was Winston who was her only person in the world whom she could swap with, as she explains in a roundabout way how she had betrayed him, in the very sense Winston had wanted to not betray her, as we saw previously. Such a betrayal necessitates her love for Winston, just as Winston's betrayal of Julia required him to love her in return. In the end, I think that the whole question of if the two could ever really have been in love is, with respect to the skeptical ones out there, a little daft. For me, the love between them is essential to highlighting the real horror of Orwell's dystopian world, how even something as natural, pure, and seemingly inviolate as a man and woman's love for one another can be destroyed, replaced with a love forged from pain and suffering, a love for Big Brother and the party. Without this genuine love between them, this key part of the story doesn't really work, as both Julia, and more importantly, as we experience events through his eyes, Winston's horrific transformation and corruption would not mean as much, and there would have been no true betrayals in the sense Winston meant it, or any obstacle for O'Brien and the party to overcome to begin with. On this issue at least, I'm as certain as I can be that Winston and Julia were genuinely in love, even if their time together was only a short one. But what do you think? Were Winston and Julia truly in love? Was the nature of their relationship always just physical and nothing more? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time.